Well, good afternoon, friends. Jared Swigert here, up in Bend, Oregon. I'm a part of the Global Immersion Project, and I'm really excited about the conversation that we get to have today with Mark Charles, an Indigenous preacher, author, and presidential candidate. And so this conversation is truly a conversation I've been looking forward to for quite some time, far before I even learned that Mark was going to be embarking upon a presidential campaign. There's a unique perspective that Mark has brought to my life theologically and practically as a peacemaker that I'm excited to wonder with him about, and for you to do that as well. And so to get things started, and this is true always for us with our webinars, our webinars are really designed to give access to very unique and necessary perspectives. And these are conversations that we're wanting to have with people who are going to frame some stuff up for us maybe differently than we've ever heard before, and then are going to invite us into restorative practice, both from a grassroots space and a grass tops space. And so, but I understand that we're all calling in from all over the country and maybe even the planet. And so, what you're going to find at the very bottom of your screen are a couple of buttons that you can play with. The first is the chat feature, and so I'm going to invite you from wherever you are right now to click that chat button. It looks like a little thought bubble with 3 dots in it. And it'd be great to hear your name and where you're from. And because of the uniqueness of this conversation, if you know the indigenous tribes on which you are now existing, if you know the names of those tribes, why don't you pop those out there? And if you don't know the names of those tribes, I invite you to take a couple of minutes to maybe explore for the first time who were the people that once upon a time navigated this land. And so I think that will help us in terms of building some awareness and opening the pores of our soul to the conversation ahead. So there's the chat feature. And then the second thing is, I'm imagining many of us are coming into this conversation with a burning question that's already on your mind. So you'll see the Q&A feature, and we want you to be friendly with both of those. And so if there's a question that's already burning inside of you that you've been wanting to ask Mark, maybe you've read his book, you've been following him for some time, you've listened to his TED Talk, or you've been following his campaign, this is the moment to pop that question in the Q&A feature. And so go ahead and do that right now, and then I'm going to do my best throughout this conversation to move toward your questions so that we can get Mark to interact with them. Global Immersion is a peacemaking organization, and we're training people of faith to engage our divided world in restorative ways. And so everything that we do is really driven by 2 core questions. Number 1, who must we become? And number 2, how do we join God in remaking the world? There's this deep conviction that we have that God actually is remaking the world, that we actually get to be a part of it in subtle, mundane, and profound ways. And so everything that we're doing is designed to help us become the women and men who actually can join God and others in making things new. And so, and this conversation is going to be a necessary one along the way for us. And so in this morning's or this afternoon's conversation, we're going to talk Doctrine of Discovery. We're going to talk Manifest Destiny. We're going to talk Thanksgiving. We're going to talk about all of those things in a recently released book that our team thinks is a must-read called Unsettling Truths. And then we're going to talk about a presidential campaign, which is a unique embodiment of the message that we're going to learn about. And we're going to talk about a presidential campaign through the lenses of peacemaking. And we're going to dig into that a bit with Mark here in a little bit. The entire conversation is going to be framed through the lenses of the 4 practices of everyday peacemaking, being see, immerse, contend, and restore. And so as Mark invites us into this story, I want to invite us to think about, like, what are the things that I'm seeing now that I haven't seen before? What are the invitations to immerse deeper into a story or into proximity with people that are unlike me that I'm experiencing here? And what does it maybe mean for us to contend for a better future, a more just future as a result of this conversation? So be thinking about those things along the way. Mark, thank you for spending some time with us here. I know there's so much happening around the country, and your campaign is taking you all over the place. But I wonder if you just begin, for those of us who are maybe less familiar with you, just locate yourself, give us a brief introduction, then we'll dive right into the conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So, Mark Charles, Sin Bake Dana Nishla, the Tohiglin Bashichin, Sinbakadana Dasha Che, the Totochini Dasha Nella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, which is why I say Sinbakadana. Translated loosely, it means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my mother's father, or my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sinbakadana. And then my fourth clan, my father's Totochini, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I am talking to you today in Washington, D.C., where I live with my family, and I am on the land of the Piscataway people. These are the lands, these are the people who lived here, they hunted here, they fished here, they raised their families here and buried their dead here. These were the people who inhabited these lands, whose nations stood here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And I like to acknowledge the lands of the people I'm on, no matter where I go around the country. I also want to acknowledge that you're in Bend, Oregon, which is the land of the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs, I believe.
That's right.
And I also want to honor that I've been in Bend, Oregon. I've been to your Blockbuster, the only one in the country.
The only one.
But yeah, I want to also honor the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs and appreciate the work that they have done to steward those lands there.
Mm-hmm.
For those who are looking and want to understand more of whose lands they are on, there's a good website. It's not the absolute authority, but it's one of the best places to start your research. It's native-lands.ca. And if you enter in your zip code, or if you enter in your city and town, it will give you a very good idea of what tribes live there traditionally, what treaties were taking place on that land, and even what language families are from that area. So it's a great place to begin your research. It's once again native, NATIVE-lands with a plural, .ca.
Thanks for that. That's a super helpful resource. I was recently at the reservation in Warm Springs, chatting with a couple of elders, and it was, it's still obviously in the wake of much of the pipeline, the tragedy that's happening in the Dakotas. And I was chatting with the elders about it, and I asked them, has something like that ever happened here in the Warm Springs? They go, what do you mean happened? As in past tense? And I'm like, yeah. And they said, right now our mineral water is being mined by companies like Nestle and others that are literally harvesting water from below the ground. And so it heightened my awareness that this is happening. This continues to happen. The pillaging of land and natural resources away from our Indigenous relatives. And so thanks for that resource. I think that's going to be helpful for people who are listening in. Mark, one of the things that I've noticed over the last probably 4 or 5 years is that among the community of emerging white allies, there seems to be an acknowledgement around Columbus Day turned Indigenous Peoples Day and Thanksgiving, utilizing social media for people to offer some sort of acknowledgement of the tragedy of manifest destiny, the tragedies of Thanksgiving and the myths that have been taught us in our educational upbringings. And it feels like a well-intentioned gesture to say, hey, I want to acknowledge that the story that I've been told is not the whole story. And yet I feel like, and myself included, I haven't personally been invited into nor taken the initiative to take a deep dive into Manifest Destiny and Doctrine of Discovery, which is why I'm so excited about your book called Unsettling Truths. And so for many of people who are maybe aware that the story is not maybe what we thought it was, but are less familiar with the Doctrine of Discovery, can you give us an idea of what this is, and what are the agreements and the systems that were created then that we're living in today?
Yeah, well, so the Doctrine of Discovery, it's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church. The first one was written in 1452. The last one was written in 1493. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. So this was literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa and colonize the continent because they didn't believe the people there to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. You know, you can't discover lands already inhabited. That's called stealing. The fact that we honor Columbus not only with the day of Columbus Day, but with statues and with proclamations and in our history books, we honor him as the discoverer of America. This reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is that Native peoples and people of color are not fully human. Now, it's this doctrine that gets embedded into the foundations of the nation. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he says to the colonies essentially that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upsets the colonists. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. They accused the king in their letter of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they go on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and brought on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. It's literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, that the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making our declaration a systemically white supremacist document that was written because the king was trying to take away the right of discovery of the native lands. Now, a few years later, the founders of this nation write a new document. They start this one with the words, "We the people." This, of course, is a preamble to the Constitution, but if you read just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2, which is the section of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not a part of the Union, who is not covered by this Constitution. When you read Article 1, Section 2, you will note it never mentions women, which is important because if you read the entire Constitution, preamble to the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns, 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by this document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. So Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, and it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, in the 1770s, it's literally white men.
Yeah.
And white landowning men is technically who could vote. So again, the Constitution was written for the purpose of protecting the interests of white landowning men. You know, we tend to not think about it in that terms, but this helps explain a lot of things. You know, when it now suddenly makes sense that women earn 70 to 80 cents to the dollar, 50 to 60 cents to the dollar if you measure out over their careers. The Constitution's working. Our prisons are filled with people of color. Well, yeah, this isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. 2010, the Supreme Court sides with Citizens United, rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This opens the door for super PACs, unlimited support of candidates. The Constitution is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. Now, there's a crisis going on today in Indian country. It's called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, where literally hundreds, over the past few decades, thousands of Indigenous women and girls have been murdered, have gone missing, and they just disappear. There's very little follow-up by law enforcement. There's no database, like they're reported missing oftentimes, but there's nothing is heard from them. There's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing, been murdered, and there's very little follow-up, very little understanding what happened to them. So in Canada, they began raising up this issue, and this is caught on in the U.S. too, because it's an epidemic here as well. And you know, we have a lot of leaders, a lot of politicians who are promising that they will propose new laws or enact new policies to protect this vulnerable demographic. In fact, just 2 days ago, I think it was on Wednesday, or yesterday, I think it was, President Trump signed an executive order to protect Indigenous women in response to this crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Now, I applaud all of these actions, whether it's been a state that's taken action on this, or the federal government, or even the White House. However, all of these actions don't go far enough. You know, they're proposing new laws, they're writing new executive orders, they're proposing new policies. But when your Declaration of Independence refers to natives as savages, and your Constitution never mentions women, you should not be surprised when your Indigenous women go missing or get murdered, and society responds with a collective shrug. We don't need a new law. We need a new basis for our laws. This is a foundational problem. I was at an event early this month, and November is for the past several decades has been Native American Heritage Month. And at this event, I was with several other Native peoples, and we wanted to express our solidarity with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to raise that awareness at this event. And so we decided to all wear red. And I wanted what I wore that day in red to be significant. And so I decided to tie my CA, my Navajo bun, which you can see here, in red yarn. I've been wearing my CAs in a Navajo bun for about 15 years, and I almost always tie it with white wool yarn. And I decided beginning of the month that I was going to tie it in red wool yarn to stand in solidarity, to raise the awareness of the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And every morning when I tie my bun, you know, for the Navajo people, our hair is sacred. Our wisdom is held in our hair, and tying your bun can even be ceremonial. And so I have been praying in the mornings when I tie my bun, praying for our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, praying that they will be seen throughout our nation, and reminding myself that there's a crisis that we need to be aware of. And I've literally been traveling all over the country. I think I counted up the other day, I have spoken or done interviews, podcasts, taught seminars 56 times in the past 6 weeks, in about 20 to 25 different locations all around the country, and even in Canada. And everywhere I've gone, I've worn my hair in this red CA. And I have talked as frequently as I can about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And everywhere I go, I'm reminding people, this is a foundational level problem. This is what happens when your declaration refers to natives as savages and your Constitution never mentions women. So this is how these foundations, influenced by the Doctrine of Discovery, are still impacting our world today. And this is just one of the ways that it's impacting our world today.
Yes, yes. I hear you saying over and over again, the Constitution is working as it was designed. It's, in other words, the plight of our Indigenous sisters is as it was actually designed to be, if we're looking at the Constitution through the lenses that you're inviting us to see them through. I'm going to ask you a chicken and an egg question, because what I think is really interesting, Mark, is that you began with the papal bulls. So you began with theology and faith, whereas I feel like there's this weird dichotomy in American Christianity around, like, I don't know, is like the Constitution political? Is it a theological document? But I think mostly it's a political document, right? But what I hear you saying is that there is actually a theology that generated an expression of life in search of a constitution that would justify the theology. Is that the right order of it, or would you say that there's a set of values and motivations that generated a theology that then generated a constitution and a rule of governance?
Well, in the first 4 chapters of our book, we lay out the Doctrine of Discovery and look at the history of the church, of how did the church get from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, how to get from there to a doctrine of discovery, which is about killing people who don't look like you, act like you, believe like you, or live like you. And to get there, you have to have some major wrong turns and some massive theological gymnastics in order to get to that point. And in our book, we highlight the writings of a bishop of Caesarea, whose name was Eusebius, who wrote a book called Ecclesiastical History. And we go through this volume in our book, Unsettling Truths. We go through this volume of 11 books, helping people understand how he basically proposed this heresy of a Christian empire, something which Jesus was adamantly against. He proposed this idea to Constantine because he was looking for a way to end the persecution that the church was enduring, had been enduring for 4 centuries. And Constantine bites, becomes a Christian, converts Rome to Christianity, and creates this heresy, this heretical institution known as Christendom, Christian empire. Mm-hmm. We also point out, because if you're gonna suggest a heresy of Christian empire and you want to really build your society around this, the first thing you have to do is get rid of Christ, because he was adamantly opposed to Christian empire. He said over and over, "My kingdom's not of this world." He was about laying down his life, not saving it. He was about carrying his cross, not protecting himself. And when you read the final chapter of the last book in this volume of 11 books, the conclusion that Eusebius comes to actually has very little to do with Christ. It's about the salvation that comes to Rome through Constantine. He literally writes Christ out of ecclesiastical history, which is what you have to do if you want to create this heresy and have the church move forward with it. And so by creating this heresy known as Christian empire, now instead of the church prophesying to empire, now it's colluding with empire to control society. And so this is a huge turning point in the church. And while it may have seemed minor and even brought some relief to some persecuted believers back in the 4th century, 1,500, almost 2,000 years later, we're a completely different point where we literally have the church throughout the history of the United States and of Western Europe condoning slavery and enacting genocide. We have, instead of God allowing through the Holy Spirit, allowing the disciples to speak the language of the nation, we have churches literally whipping children in boarding schools for having the gall to speak their own native tongues. And so this is the challenge, is when the church writes Christ out of its own history and gets in bed with empire and makes a Messiah figure out of the emperor Constantine, now the church is becoming the very thing it used to be prophetic against. And this is what I would argue, this is what makes the injustices and the violence of Western society even worse. Because again, when you look at Christian nations, if you're gonna believe in this heresy of a Christian empire, the closest example you're gonna have is Old Testament Israel, which again was a people chosen by God and set apart for a purpose. This is pre-Christ, and this nation had promised lands. And the way they were commanded to take possession of their promised lands was literally to commit genocide, to leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. In fact, Israel's sin in the Old Testament is that they didn't complete their genocide. They left some people alive and they intermarried with them.
That's right. Yeah.
And so this is what actually exacerbates the violence of a secular nation, is when it has a theology behind it that justifies it, because now you don't even feel guilty for it. Now you feel like you're fighting a righteous war. You're fighting on the side of God, as you're cleansing the world of evil by literally killing people that you consider to be subhuman.
So then I think we also need we also need a whitewashed myth that there was this big table with a turkey on it. You know, like, so in other words, not only was this mass genocide the real truth in the name of God, but we have to create a myth that says, but no, all of the Indians and the Pilgrims sat around a big wooden table with a big turkey on it, and they sang Kumbaya or whatever they did.
Yeah.
Talk to me just really briefly, because there's like 3 other things I really want you to dive into.
Yeah.
But talk to us about why the need for the myth. If the truth is this, how do the myths emerge, and how have they survived the way that they've survived for all of these years?
Well, the myths emerge, the myths exist because American exceptionalism is the coping mechanism for a nation that's in deep denial of its genocidal past as well as its current racist reality. So our nation, which has committed tremendous violence, ethnic cleansing, genocide, slavery, all these horrible things, internment camps. We've killed over 300,000 civilians through dropping of bombs, including nuclear bombs in Japan during World War II. I mean, we are an incredibly violent nation, and we justify that by telling ourselves that we're exceptional. Now, in our book, Sungchan and I go very deep into this myth of American exceptionalism, which is literally based on the lie of white supremacy. And our nation needs to tell itself it's exceptional, because if we're not exceptional, if we don't have some unique and special relationship with God, if we don't have promised lands, if we don't have a manifest destiny, then we're merely just another colonial genocidal nation. And that thought is unfathomable to most Americans who want to be the good guys, who want to be the ones on the side of truth and justice and equality and freedom, when our history is actually none of that. And so we cling with everything we have to this narrative of exceptionalism. We see that in our politics. We see that in our churches. We see that in our public discourse. This notion that we are exceptional as a people because this is the only way we can go to sleep at night, knowing what we've done in our past to become who we are. And so when we look at Thanksgiving is absolutely a myth that has very little basis in reality. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to be on a radio show here in Washington, D.C. It's on a station called WPFW. They're a local public access, our public broadcast station, but they stream online. And beginning at 8 a.m., the Jay Winter Nightwolf show, which he's a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, and he has a 5-hour Thanksgiving Day special show tomorrow. For the first half hour to 45 minutes, he's going to present his history and what he's learned about the first Thanksgiving. We're then going to have a conversation with someone, I believe, from Dartmouth, who is a professor of Native American history. And then I'm going to present about 45 minutes to an hour on Abraham Lincoln's proclamation of Thanksgiving in 1863. And this show will be streamed live online. It's WPFW. They also archive it so you can find it later. But I'm going to go into depth into Abraham Lincoln's proclamation, which was, so Abraham Lincoln, before 1863, Thanksgiving was celebrated kind of on a state-by-state basis. It was more popular in the East than it was in the West. And there was no set date or, it wasn't a national holiday yet. It was well known, but there was a push to make it more of a national holiday. And Abraham Lincoln in 1863 proclaimed that the last Friday in November was going to be this day of Thanksgiving. And when you understand the history of Abraham Lincoln, who not only was a blatant and unapologetic white supremacist, but one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history, as he ethnically cleansed Minnesota, Colorado, and New Mexico to make way for the Transcontinental Railway. Even when you look at the timing of his proclamation, which was in the fall of 1863, literally while his armies are going through and ethnically cleansing the Navajo and Mescalero Apache from the territory of New Mexico. and moving us down to what can best only be described as a death camp called Fort Sumner, which he himself gave the approval to create. And he's thanking God for the expansion of our borders. He's thanking God that the axe and the plow have increased the output of the nation. And he later goes on to call all the citizens to take this day and give thanks. Now, if you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and even in his inauguration and throughout his political career, Abraham Lincoln was very, very clear. He had no intention of allowing people of color to be citizens. He had no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of allowing them to hold office, nor to intermarry. He was actively committing genocide against Native peoples. He was asked by Judge Douglas, he was accused by Judge Douglas of wanting to make citizens of black people. And he said, I have no intention of making black people citizens. In fact, if the states may have the right to do that, but if Illinois were to enact that, I would be opposed to it. Abraham Lincoln, and so his call literally is for this white supremacist nation to come together, offer up thanks to God for the ethnic cleansing and expansion of their borders and the process of completing their manifest destiny. And this is what moved Thanksgiving into the modern era. It literally, like, it'd be almost like if Adolf Hitler declared a holiday because the Holocaust was going so well. And then somehow that holiday continued to exist throughout the 21st century. I mean, it's appalling.
Yeah, it is. And this is like, I hear you in your TED Talk, you referenced George Erasmus and this idea that where we do not share a common memory, community is impossible, much less the restoration that we seek, right? Or the peace that we seek. If we don't share a common memory. I just want to talk really briefly to the audience who's listening in right now. I want to ask us to just pay attention. Maybe if you're writing something down or you're writing in your journal or whatever you're doing, what are you seeing now that you didn't see 30 minutes ago? And I also want to invite you to consider, what do you feel compelled to immerse into now? What's a step toward something, someone, a next step that you're compelled to take based on what you're hearing right now? Let's not let what's happening in this conversation wave over us. Let's intend for it to land, and then make some decisions around see and immerse here beyond the call. I feel like this for me is a moment of searching for common memory. And some of the things that you're saying, Mark, I have simply never heard before. And so how do we go about establishing common memory? And continue to talk about this with regard to Doctrine of Discovery, Thanksgiving, the genocide of the Indigenous peoples. But I also want you to help us think about, like, in other systemic ways or even interpersonal ways, why is common understanding so important if we're actually going to move through conflict to become transformed?
The whole quote by George Erasmus, and I love this quote, is he says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, he says, you have to start by creating a common memory. I love this quote because it gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we don't have this common memory. We have a white majority that has constructed and remembers this mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived history of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of boarding schools and Indian massacres, of internment camps and segregation, of mass incarceration and families being separated at the borders. There's no common memory, and there's no point you can look at in the entire history of the United States where there was a healthy community across racial lines. You know, a lot of people, especially today, lament the fact that Congress has lost its ability to compromise and work across the aisles. And many people will talk about the good old days, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, when there was cooperation between the parties and party leaders and politicians could reach across the aisle and work with other politicians. Well, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, segregation was in full effect.
Mm-hmm.
Natives were sitting in boarding schools. Congress was an old white landowning men's club. Of course, they were able to reach across the aisle. They all agreed on the place of the races. 2016 has the most diverse Congress in our history. We have more people of color, more women, more members of LGBTQ, more people of other religions serving in Congress than at any other point in history. There are now people around the table who are trying to legislate who have a very different memory than the white majority who still serves in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the reasons why Congress is literally losing its ability to work across the aisle, because, you know, I firmly believe, if either President Trump or Vice President Biden, let me say this a different way. If President Obama had acted in the way that either President Trump is acting or Vice President Biden was acting in regards to his son serving on this board in Ukraine, President Obama would have been ousted, not only impeached, but removed from office by a majority, bipartisan majority of both Democrats and Republicans. This is the challenge we have.
Because you're saying that because of the white majority in Congress, their shared memory, their common memory is white supremacy. So what we have in Congress is we have white landowning men holding other white landowning men accountable in a system that was designed to protect white landowning men. Mm-hmm. So even Nixon, who got impeached and removed from office, he was still pardoned and didn't serve much time in jail. There was no real cost, real hard time served because of what he did. Just a few weeks ago, several Republicans took their cell phones into a top secret clearance area of the Capitol, and none of them paid a price for that. Sure, a few Democrats decried it and said they shouldn't do that. But if you and I had done that as average citizens, if I had done that as a Navajo man, we'd be sitting in jail right now. Yeah.
We have a political system where white landowning men are responsible for keeping other white landowning men accountable within a system that was designed to protect white landowning men. And the problem is they've learned that even if they break the rules, there is no real consequence. Mm-hmm. Now that we have a more diverse Congress, now that there are people who have a different memory and who are saying we the people needs to be more inclusive and defined more broadly, now I think there's a threat that the cost of the level of accountability could be held higher. Mm-hmm. And if you ask me, that's what's terrifying Congress right now.
So
you have women, you have people of color, you have LGBTQ who have a very different memory, and are actually interested in having some accountability here, and that's terrifying the white landowning male majority.
And that's I want to turn a corner then, Mark, into the fact that you are a presidential candidate. You're the first presidential candidate that we've had the opportunity to have a conversation like this with, and it is an honor to be able to explore this with you a bit from a peacemaking perspective. We talk all the time about how peace needs to be made internal, interpersonally, and systemically. And we talk about the value of political advocacy and how it actually matters to use your vote, and how that is a tool in the peacemaking tool chest. You are now entering into the race for the most powerful seat, arguably, in the planet. And I want to talk about that in a second, but I want to start with how I observed you starting this. Where I've seen over the years, I've seen other presidential candidates go to a place where as many people as possible would be in the room together, and then they would use that moment to launch their campaign. I noticed that you went very quietly to the elders. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about why your first step was immersing into conversation and deeper into relationship with the elders. And I wonder if you could give us a little peek into what that conversation was like, and how what was said there to you is informing how you're approaching your candidacy today.
Yeah, so I lived for 11 years on our reservation, the Navajo Nation. Our reservation is located in the Four Corners area. We have land in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And I observed 3 presidential elections from there. Now, our reservation is 26,000 square miles. If we were a state, we'd be the 40th largest state. We have 300,000 enrolled tribal members. Our reservation is massive compared to most reservations. Most reservations are very small compared to ours. And none of those elections did we get campaigned to. We heard candidates saying, I'm going to go here and talk to get the African-American vote. I'm going here to get the Hispanic Latino vote. I'm going here to get the white vote. I'm going here to get the women's vote. But no one ever said they're going anywhere to get the Native vote. And it's because our people have been so marginalized, our numbers have been so diminished, and we've been spread out so far across the country that we have no impact on the Electoral College. Even our reservation, which is in 3 states, 26,000 square miles, but we don't make up a single congressional district in Arizona, New Mexico, or Utah. As a result, we have very little impact on the Electoral College. And so while I was there, I felt very strongly that if you want to be president of this nation, which resides on the lands known by Indigenous peoples as Turtle Island, the most respectful place to begin your campaign is to the Indigenous peoples of this land. You know, most candidates, they make their very progressive announcements, and then they run off to where? Well, they run off to Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa is the 5th whitest state in the country. New Hampshire is the 3rd. They both have higher than average rates of land ownership. It was after the assassination of Dr. King, the very next election in 1972, that Iowa, the Democratic Party pushed to have Iowa become so there was a lot of political reform going on, the way elections were being run after 68 and the crisis both around the Vietnam War as well as the shooting of Dr. King. And in 72, the Democrats really pushed forward this idea of making Iowa the first caucus state. And New Hampshire already had a very well-established party of being the first primary in the nation. And so it literally put these 2 incredibly white states at the point, the entry point, as the gatekeepers of deciding who's going to actually run for and become president. And so again, all of our candidates, Democrat and Republican, white or people of color, they make their announcements and then they run off to get the support, the buy-in, the money, and the vote of white landowning men, which almost assures that there's going to be very little systemic change, because the way you get white landowning men to vote for you, the way you get them to support you, the way you get them to get on your side politically is you tell them how exceptional they are. So in the last election, Donald Trump won with the slogan of making America great again. Hillary Clinton, not to be outdone, told her supporters that America is great already. At the Democratic National Convention, President Obama jumps into the fray and says America is already pretty great. And Cory Booker, in 2016, he's a rising star of the Democratic Party. He's on the main stage endorsing Hillary Clinton. And in his speech, he acknowledges that the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as savages. He acknowledges the Constitution excludes women, and he acknowledges the Three-Fifths Compromise for Black people, which is all very courageous. Most candidates at that level don't acknowledge any of these things. He acknowledged all three. But he kept his political ambitions alive by telling the white landowning male base of the Democratic Party that these things do not affect our nation's greatness.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I completely disagree. The systemic racism, sexism, white supremacy in our foundations absolutely have an impact on how can we even talk about being great? We can't even treat everybody as human. Like, these are two very different conversations. And so what I felt when I decided to launch my campaign is I felt very, very strongly that I want to completely decenter whiteness. Not that I'm not trying to flip the switch. I'm not trying to let white people endure the same thing people of color endured, but I am trying to decenter whiteness, to take the white landowning male out of the center where they've been singing a solo for 250 years, and instead move them to the margins where the rest of us are part of this chorus. Now, that's going to feel oppressive to them, but I'm not trying to impress them. I just want to treat them as average, which, again, when you're used to being treated as superior, being treated as average is going to feel oppressive, but I'm not actually trying to oppress them. And so I wanted to have a campaign where I didn't bring my first message and cater my voice to white landowning men. And I already felt very strongly that if you want to be president over these lands known as Turtle Island, if you want to have leadership and integrity here, the most respectful and appropriate place to begin that dialogue is with the indigenous nations of Turtle Island. And so I hosted my first campaign event on the Navajo Nation, the chapter house right near where I used to live. I then went to the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, where the Pueblos gather in New Mexico, and I hosted my second event there. I went to Colorado and went to the Denver Indian Center in Denver, Colorado. I went to South Dakota and to Pine Ridge and to Rosebud. I literally have been traveling the nation for the past 5 months, campaigning primarily on Indian lands to Native peoples. I would guess I've been on more reservations as a candidate than all previous presidential candidates combined.
What's one thing, Mark, and then I want to turn our attention to this presidential campaign itself. But what's one thing that you feel like you've heard from one of the elders that really struck you at the core, and you're riding what they said to you into this journey?
Well, so what it's not necessarily a new conversation for me. I've lived on our reservation for 11 years. I've been with our people for 11 years. I've had conversations in our communities for 11 years. And this is before I even decided to run. And one of the things that I feel most strongly about, and I think hearing it from someone who is a presidential candidate is very impactful for our Native peoples, is everywhere I go, I tell our people, we are not the helpless victims of an oppressive colonial government. We are the host people of the land. And this nation needs for us to step into our role as the host. And this is the paradigm that is already beginning to shift within Indian country. I am not by any stretch of the imagination going to take credit for having this paradigm come about. But when we had Standing Rock, where we had literally tens of thousands of Native peoples from hundreds of different tribes coming together and committed to the teachings of our elders, to prayer and to ceremony and to peaceful protest, telling our colonizers, you can't drink oil and water is life. Yeah, we lost that court case and the pipeline got built. But as far as was that a point where Native America came together and in a collective voice stepped into our role as the host people of the land? Absolutely. And when you listen to presidential candidates talk to Indian country, they talk to us almost like we are a charity case. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to acknowledge you here. I'm going to create a special voice for you. Very few candidates, if any, talk to us as if we were the host people of the land. And this is what I'm trying to do. So whether it's my immigration policy or whether it's my even other thoughts I'm laying out is that the Native voice, you know, so I'm talking among our people. Many candidates are saying, we'll create a special seat at the table on my cabinet, they're saying, where we can have a Native person there to bring perspective into all of these discussions. I'm like, you know what? I want to have a Native American Secretary of State. I would love it if this country not only had a Native president, but our head, our chief ambassador to the world was someone indigenous to Turtle Island. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Tell us what you think that would, what would that change?
Well, first of all, I think it would hopefully strengthen, but it would challenge our relationship with the nations we call our allies. Right? Most of our closest allies are all our colonial friends from 300, 400, 500 years ago.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And to have not only a Native president, but a Native Secretary of State, talking with the Queen, talking with the Prime Minister of the UK, talking with the leaders of France and Germany, of the Netherlands, all deeply, deeply colonial nations who have never fully wrestled with their colonial history. I think it could create some much needed realignment of policies and of even the direction in which we're moving forward. Which I think would be very powerful. I mean, we have been sending for literally decades, right? White landowning men to the Middle East to try and negotiate peace between Israel and Palestine. Now, this is a centuries, a millennia, thousands of year old conflict over land and the sovereignty over land and the sacredness of land. And we are sending people to try and negotiate these age-old conflicts. We are sending people who don't even know the name of the tribe that was ethnically cleansed from the land where their own house sits. And we're sending them across the ocean to try and go negotiate peace in this conflict that they haven't even begun to address in their own backyard, in their own front yard. And so again, what would it look like? How would the voice of the U.S. change if instead we sent a contingent of Native elders into that space? Whenever I've spent expensive time in the Middle East, in Israel and in Palestine, I always bring up the Bedouins. If you have the Israeli settlers taking over a piece of land from the Palestinians, they move the Bedouins. You have the Bedouins the Palestinians reclaiming some land from the settlers, they move the Bedouins. The Bedouins are the pawns. If the Israelis are comparable to the U.S. and the Palestinians are comparable to African Americans, the Bedouins are the native peoples.
That's right.
And and I tell people, go there and bring up the Bedouins, and I promise you it's going to explode the entire dialogue, because no one knows what to do with the Bedouins over there.
Yeah. So give me, and Mark, do you have, can you stay on just a few minutes longer? I'm recognizing that it is
absolutely
7. I feel like you're on a unique role, and I want to turn. So for those who are listening, and we'll maybe go just a few minutes over 12. But I want to invite you to talk to us then about this campaign. We the People is all the people, and means all the people, and cast the vision of what this actually could look like, would look like, and how do you understand it as a theologian and as a follower of Jesus? How do you understand a presidential campaign as a tool of restoration? Not just a dismantling of something that is severely broken, but there's a new world that you're wanting to usher in. Cast the vision for us and let us see it.
Well, the challenge is how do we bring about a dialogue like this? I mean, there's a reason our nation doesn't have a common memory. It's because we don't know how to talk about our own history. And so how do we create a national dialogue about our own history and get us to a point where we actually can heal it? One of the primary planks of my platform is that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I wouldn't call ours Truth and Reconciliation, though, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which is flat out not accurate. I use the term truth and conciliation. Conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute. If reconciliation perpetuates the myth we used to be great, now we're not, conciliation demands we have a much more honest starting point. And I found just changing the word brings people in a much more humble manner, because it acknowledges we're starting in a space that's broken. We're merely trying to make it better. And so one of the challenges is, how do we get our nation to talk about these things? And every 4 years, we have a national dialogue about who we are and where we're going, which is our presidential election cycle. 4 years ago, Bernie Sanders got our nation to talk about something that it didn't want to talk about, which was systemic economic inequality. He did that by running for president. Now, my critique of his run is that Bernie's an independent. He was elected to the Senate as an independent. He ran as a Democrat. Now, anyone who knew anything about politics in 2016 knew that year was Hillary Clinton's year. She had sat out 2012, so President Obama could run unopposed. 2016 was her year. The superdelegates were already lined up behind her even before the first primary vote was cast. Bernie Sanders had to have known this. I don't think he was running to win. He was running to change the conversation. He was running a protest campaign. By the time he figured out he had some traction, he was now stuck in the party that was never going to nominate him. Mm-hmm. So I didn't want to make the same mistake. I am not running a protest campaign. I am running because I believe I am the most qualified and the best person to lead our nation in 2020. The way you can tell I'm not running as a protest is because I'm not running as a Democrat. If I wanted to just change the conversation, if I wanted to just get into the debates and raise some money and make a flash in the pan, I would have run as a Democrat. I could have raised a lot more money than I'm raising right now. I could have been in the debates. We could have had this conversation. But like Bernie Sanders in 2016, I would have never been nominated. Running as an independent is the hardest, the most difficult path to get to the White House, but it's the only path that lets me actually get there. And so I'm very clear with people, I am not running a protest campaign. I am running because I want to be president of the United States of America. And I want to initiate this dialogue on race, gender, and class. Now, in his final State of the Union, President Obama was talking about the need in our nation to have a new politics. And he quoted the Constitution. He said, "We the people." Our Constitution begins with these three simple words, words that we've come to recognize mean all the people. Now that sounds beautiful. And he got a lot of applause for that line. But when I heard him say that, I asked myself, when did we decide this?
Mm-hmm.
The founding fathers did not believe we the people meant all the people. Abraham Lincoln didn't believe we the people meant all the people. As good as the civil rights movement was, it didn't get us to we the people meaning all the people. President Trump does not believe we the people means all the people. So while that sounds beautiful, we've never had that conversation. That's the conversation I'm trying to initiate. I am asking our country, if you want to put it in terms of a board meeting, I'm calling the question. Do we want to be a nation where we the people means all the people? If we do, we can't just say it and make it so. We have to go back and deal with our foundations. Because right now, our foundations literally state we the people does not mean all the people. The Doctrine of Discovery was referenced by the Supreme Court as the legal precedent for land titles as recently as 2005. And a Supreme Court opinion, which I have a TEDx talk laying out, is called We the People, the three most misunderstood words in U.S. history. I lay out in this TED talk that this is one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Because when your land titles are propped up by a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, white supremacy becomes a bipartisan value. Mm-hmm. And so my call to the nation is, do we want to be a place where we the people means all the people? If we do, then we have to deal with our foundations. We can't just say it and make it so. Mm-hmm. We have to go back and deal with our Declaration of Independence. We have to go back and deal with our Constitution. You know, right now in the Democratic Party, there's a very robust debate going on. Actually, it's not even much of a debate. It's almost a conclusion that we need to pay reparations to descendants of slaves, which I absolutely agree is correct. I'm glad we're having that conversation, and I think we do need to do that. However, if you read the 13th Amendment, we've never abolished slavery. 13th Amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. Slavery is legal under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. And we incarcerate our citizens at the highest rate of any country in the world, and we incarcerate people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate of white people. So just like if a corporation settles a class action lawsuit, and they have to pay out some sort of payment, they almost never sign on that dotted line until they can ensure, almost guarantee, that they will not be sued again. If we want America to pay reparations for slavery, and we allow them to do it before we actually abolish slavery, I promise you it will never be abolished. Because white America is not going to sign on that dotted line until they can guarantee they never have to talk about this again. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so again, great idea, but we have to talk about the foundations first. Mm-hmm. We have to bring the conversation down to a deeper level. And this is what I'm trying to do with my entire campaign. I was at a Native American forum just a few months ago in August. It's called the Frank Lemire Native American Presidential Forum. I was there with 10 of the Democratic candidates, 5 of the top 10. Elizabeth Warren was there, Bernie Sanders was there, Kamala Harris was there, Julian Castro was there, Marianne Williamson was there, and I was there as a Native candidate. And if you go back and watch those videos, and you can Google them and they'll come up, they were filmed and put online by several different organizations. you will see that with every question, I brought the conversation deeper. And I brought it down to the level where we have to have the discussion. And Esquire wrote an article after this forum. And the article was titled, Elizabeth Warren was well received at the Native American Forum, but Mark Charles was the main event. And it highlighted how I brought the conversation down to this level where we never talk about it nationally. And that's the question I'm posing is, it sounds beautiful. Yes, I would love a nation where we the people means all the people. We've never made that decision. And so that's the question I'm trying to call. That's the challenge I'm trying to make. And that's the vision of my entire campaign. And I'm loving every minute of traveling the country and talking about it all over the nation.
Yeah, and it looks like you're enjoying it from from my vantage point. It's amazing to watch the groundswell, and now even talking with you, hearing that the impetus of this is to actually, in some ways, force the conversations about the foundations that need to be had. And I can't think of a more grass tops way to enter into a presidential campaign. We're also, on the call right now, there are a number of people that probably most likely will never embark upon a presidential campaign. And so how would you, and this is my last question, and dive into this briefly so we can maybe get off by about 1:10, but what are the micro decisions, behaviors, actions, whether internal, interpersonal, or communal, that we can take to move the conversation to the foundations like these? What do we do as everyday people, understanding that we all have spheres of influence? What do we do with it? Give us our next steps from your point of view.
Well, the biggest thing we have to do is we have to change our paradigm. We have a very well constructed and pretty solid mythology based on this myth of American exceptionalism and the lie of white supremacy. And we have to begin deconstructing this. This is what my book is all about. I am trying to, with my co-author Sing-Chan Ra, the book is called Unsettling Truth. We are trying to deconstruct this mythology and change people's paradigms. So I've been lecturing about this history for the past 5 or even 7 to 8 years. And the goal of my lectures, the goal of my book, is not for an immediate response. I'm trying to help people to see a history they've never seen, to hear a narrative they've never heard. And once you see it, once you hear it, you can't unsee it. And my best conversations don't happen immediately after a lecture or even the next day or even the next week. The best dialogues I have about this content happen 6 to 9 months later when I run into someone and they say, hey, I've heard your lecture, I listened to you speak, I read an article you wrote, and I have been able to put that down. 6 months later, I now have a few thoughts, and now we're ready to have a conversation. And this is a challenge because the Doctrine of Discovery props up land titles. This is why we don't talk about it. Because putting land titles on the table, deconstructing a system that props up land titles is incredibly disruptive. And nobody wants to have that conversation, at least nobody in their immediate moment. But as we begin to shift this paradigm, as we begin to help people see how systemic and how deep, how violent and how vile this history is, it actually moves people towards saying, yes, we want to make some systemic level change. In my announcement video, which is on my website, and we just launched a new version of our website today, markcharles2020.com. And in this video, it's a 9-minute announcement video for my campaign. We announced in end of May last spring, so 5-6 months ago. And in this campaign, I frame my campaign as an 18-month journey. I know just by presenting this information today, I'm not going to persuade the bulk of Americans to vote for me today. That's fine. I don't need them to vote for me today. I need them to vote for me in 11 and a half months from now. And so I am going to take all of this time to teach this history, to engage this dialogue, to move this conversation forward, hoping that even if they walk into the ballot box undecided, they might get there and say, you know what, Mark's right. We need to have this dialogue. We have to have this conversation. I want him to be my president. Just in end of October, every year, every president since Lincoln has proclaimed a Native American Heritage Week or Native American Heritage Month for the month of November. In October of 2019, President Trump again made this proclamation, but then he made another proclamation. And he also proclaimed November 2019 to be the inaugural American History and Founders Month. And he said he wanted a better educated citizenry. And he was again running with his notion, his memory of an exceptional history. Now, I get tired of censoring President Trump everywhere I go and allowing his chaos to consume me or the dialogue I'm trying to engage. And so I usually ignore him. But when he made this, what I would consider a very inconsiderate announcement, proclamation, because if November is Native American Heritage Month and you understand anything about our history, you will know our history and our founders have been anything but friendly to Native peoples. And so to proclaim Native American Heritage Month and American History and Founders Month simultaneously is at best inconsiderate, if not flat out, I don't even know what word to use, but
provocative,
flat out,
antagonistic.
Not even provocative, just antagonistic. Thank you. And so I was considering saying something, calling out his inconsiderate words, but I instead decided to lean into it. Fine, President Trump, you want to talk about our history? You want to discuss our founders? I have a great new book for you. I'll even sign it. Let's talk about our history. Let's talk about our founders. I've traversed the nation this month, talking to thousands of people about our history and about our founders. And I am convinced, I am positive President Trump and I will come to absolutely different conclusions. But if he wants to talk about these things, I am all for it. I would love I have not only relished the opportunity to do that this month, but I look forward to having the opportunity to debate our history and our founders with him when we get into the general election next summer and fall.
Mark, thank you so much.
This is necessary if we're going to create this common memory.
Yeah, I'm just registering in my own body how for so long I have opted. I've been groomed to opt for the convenient myths, the mythology, and watching you from afar now, being in dialogue with you, I know that the work that I have to do is there's some see and immerse work that I have to do personally to figure out what does it mean to actually get clearer on the truth about the foundations, and so I'm so grateful for you and am inspired by the dream and the vision that you have. And to those of you who are listening in, let me offer a couple of ideas. First of all, there's going to be a follow-up email that's going to have this recording. It'll come to you in about a week, sometime after the weekend, but it's going to have the link to Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles and Soong-Chan Rah on in the email. So I want to encourage you, like you've seen, I would encourage you to take the next step, which would be to immerse into the pages of this book. And I was noticing so many of the questions that were emerging are actually addressed by these two authors in the book itself. And so I think you'll find those answers there. So that's going to be a major link. This webinar, you're going to have the recording of this. And we always encourage people to utilize the recordings of these webinars to host living room viewings. and utilize this as an opportunity to catalyze some of the conversations that we just heard Mark invite us into. So you're gonna see that link. Third, there's going to be a link to Mark's TED Talk that he referenced, where he dives a bit deeper, and he's got some incredible slides that actually dive into the language of some of these founding documents to help us learn more and to face the truth there. And so those resources are going to be coming to you after the weekend. I would encourage you, as you enter into shared tables, most likely with friends and family this weekend, to maybe dial in the one most provocative aha moment or key learning. And it maybe not just that, hey, I learned a new piece of information, but something that you heard Mark say that landed deep inside of you. Maybe not in an effort to recite everything that has just happened in this conversation, but if there's one thing that has landed for you, I wonder what would happen if you were to maybe just humbly offer that into the conversation and wonder with your friends and family about that thing that you heard Mark invite us to wonder about. Maybe that's the best practice for us around our tables here this weekend. And so markcharles2020.com is where you can learn more about Mark and about his presidential campaign. I encourage you to go there and check it out. And Mark, again, a blessing on you. And my friend, thank you so much for the way that you're cultivating our souls and opening up our pores to a more real. So bless you, friend. Bless you, friends. We'll see you real soon on our next webinar.
Thank you very much. And Hakonet.